Welcome back to Occult Archives, listeners. Each week, we take a journey into the shadows of history, exploring the most, well, let's just say, interesting books ever written.
Right.
From forbidden texts to ancient rituals and, yeah, a few things that probably should have stayed buried. I'm your host, by the way.
And I'm the expert, the one who actually reads these things.
Lucky you. Today, we're cracking open a book that still sparks debate, even a century after it was written, The Witch Cult in Western Europe, by the one and only Margaret Alice Murray. But bold woman with, let's say, unconventional ideas.
Unconventional is putting it mildly.
So, Season 1, Episode 59, we're asking the big question. Did paganism survive under the very nose of Christian Europe? Did these so-called witches really worship the devil, or was there something more to the story?
Murray's book dives headfirst into that very question.
And to find answers, she takes us straight into the heart of the witch trials.
Not just the accusations, but the actual records, the words of the accused. It's chilling, to say the least.
She suggests these trials weren't just about devil worship. They might have been about something much older, something pre-Christian, misinterpreted, and, well, demonized.
Yeah, exactly. The heart of her argument is this. The figure that witches supposedly worshipped, the one everyone called the devil, might have actually been a holdover from an older pagan god.
Right, not the devil, but a god.
Yeah.
So when we look at the descriptions from these trials, what do we actually see? What kind of image emerges?
Well, you'd think everyone would describe the same horned red guy, right? Yeah. Not even close. The descriptions are all over the place. Yeah, the black man pops up a lot in trials spanning decades, but it's definitely not the only one.
So what else do we have?
We see an old man with a gray beard, a man in green clothes.
Okay, not exactly what you'd picture.
And this is interesting. Some even describe him as a physician, a mediciner even.
A healer.
Yeah, a healer. That's not very devil-like, is it?
Not the image that comes to mind, no. It definitely throws a wrench in the whole evil incarnate thing.
It does. And that healing aspect, well, it makes you think about those old pantheons where gods and goddesses often had lots of different roles.
Right, they weren't just one-dimensional.
So maybe the accused were understanding their experiences through a completely different lens.
A pagan lens, you mean?
Exactly. And then there are the even weirder descriptions.
Oh yeah, let's hear those.
Things like a broad gentleman or a pretty boy in green clothes. Even, get this, the likeness of her own husband.
Wow. Talk about a curveball.
And then there's the young man beside a standing stone. Yeah. I mean, that just screams ancient pagan site, doesn't it?
It really does. It's almost like a scene straight out of some ancient myth.
And sure, you get some more demonic-sounding ones, too. The meekle black rogue man with forked and cloven feet, for example.
Okay, that's a bit more on brand.
But overall, the picture is far from consistent.
So what do we make of that? Could it mean this god had different forms depending on the region? Or maybe it was a mix of pagan ideas and the Christian devil all rolled into one?
Yeah, maybe people were trying to make sense of what they were experiencing using the beliefs they knew, even if those beliefs were, well, a bit mixed up.
Makes sense. And what about those times the descriptions wander into folklore territory? The man in the likeness of a stag or the queen of elfin? That doesn't sound very Christian devil-like.
That's where Murray's theory gets really fascinating. That mention of the queen of elfin. Pure fairy folklore.
Fairies.
And many scholars think those fairy beliefs come straight from older pagan traditions.
So fairies as pagan deities.
It's a possibility. Then you have figures like Christen Day. He's described as both an angel and God's godson, but also connected to the queen.
That's confusing.
Right. It's almost like a mashup of Christian and pagan figures.
Like they were merging into one.
Exactly. And even Anne Chaddock, she talks about she-spirits and duels. Maybe that shows a more complex view of the spirit world than the simple good versus evil of Christianity.
So were these witches worshiping the devil, or were they interacting with beings from a whole different belief system?
A system that was being demonized by the church, you mean? Hard to say for sure.
A lot of gray areas there. Okay, so Murray also argues that this alleged witch cult had a specific structure. Covens of 13 members, each led by an officer. Is there anything in the trials that supports this idea of a formal organization?
The number 13 does appear a lot, and not just randomly. There's little Janet Howitt from the Forfar trials. She specifically said there were 13 people present with the devil.
13 people?
Yeah. And while not every trial mentions that exact number, it does keep coming up in different places and times. It definitely caught Murray's attention.
She saw it as a pattern.
And who knows, maybe it's more than just coincidence. 13 has always had symbolic meaning, often tied to lunar cycles and potentially to ancient gatherings.
Maybe those accused of witchcraft were tapping into something ancient.
Could be. And then, of course, there's the question of leadership.
Right, the officers. Did anyone ever mention those?
Isabel Gowdy did. She actually named names: the maiden and the officer of her coven. That clearly points to some kind of hierarchy.
So it wasn't just a bunch of people hanging out.
No, there was structure. And she also said, there are threatened miscurtons in ilk coven. 13 again. That adds weight to the idea of a set size for these covens.
Okay, starting to see the pattern here. But Murray didn't start there. She thought these covens were part of a bigger network, all answering to a grand master at larger assemblies.
The SBATs.
The SBATs. Was there any evidence of this bigger, more connected structure?
Well, the term Grand Master does show up sometimes, usually when describing the main deity figure. That hints at leadership.
Makes sense.
And trial records talk about these big gatherings, usually called sabbats.
Sabbats, right. What happened at those?
There were supposed to be times when lots of people would come together from different areas. Maybe they were doing rituals, maybe getting instructions, maybe reporting to a central figure.
So maybe a grandmaster wasn't so far-fetched?
It's definitely possible. We know these gatherings could be big, involving people from all over the place. That suggests some level of network, even if we don't know exactly how formal it was.
It's like piecing together a puzzle. We have these fragments, these hints, and we're trying to figure out the big picture.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, let's move on to the rituals themselves. This is where it gets really interesting and maybe a bit unsettling. What kind of ceremonies and actions are described in the witch trial records?
Okay, well, we have to remember that most of what we know comes from the accusers, and they obviously had a very specific agenda.
Right, they weren't exactly unbiased observers.
But even so, some common threads do emerge. For example, initiation into the cult often involved renouncing Christianity and baptism.
Wow. A pretty bold move in those days.
Yeah, you wouldn't do that lightly. We see with Louis Gaufredi and Jeanette de Bady, this deliberate turning away from the official religion says a lot.
It says they were choosing something else, something different. What do you think that meant for these people, psychologically, to turn their backs on everything they knew?
Well, it must have been a huge decision, a dangerous one even. It shows they were truly committing to a different set of beliefs, a different community.
And that commitment took other forms, too, right?
Oh, absolutely. There were vows of fidelity to the devil, or to whatever that central figure was.
Okay, that's getting into classic witchcraft territory.
Right, and then there was baptism, but in the devil's name this time, giving new names, marking the body with a flesh brand.
Right.
All these things were supposed to signify allegiance.
It sounds almost like joining a secret society.
Yeah, and the fact that sometimes new members were introduced by existing ones suggests a real process, like a formal initiation.
Not just anyone could join. Okay, so a defined entry process. But what about regular meetings? The sabbats or SBATs we talked about earlier? What were those like?
Descriptions vary, but again, there's some recurring themes. People were supposed to arrive by supernatural means.
Flying on broomsticks.
Well, maybe not always broomsticks, but yeah, that was the general idea.
Okay, let's go with that. What else?
They would pay homage to the central figure. Kneeling, gestures, kissing, all signs of respect and submission. But it wasn't all serious business. They also talk about feasting and dancing, so there was definitely a communal aspect to these gatherings, maybe even celebratory.
So not your typical church service then?
No, not exactly. And they often use lights or candles, sometimes with a blue flame, which adds a really ritualistic feel.
It's interesting to think about the social aspect of this, right? Maybe for people who felt marginalized, these gatherings offered a sense of belonging, of shared identity.
Yeah, that's a good point, especially in those days when life was hard and society was so rigid.
And the feasting and dancing, that really contrasts with the grim image of devil worship, doesn't it?
It does. It almost makes you wonder if they were more like dot festivals than anything else.
And then there are the descriptions of what Murray interprets as religious services.
Yeah, those get pretty wild. There are mentions of sacramental bread associated with the devil, mock masses that parody Christian rituals.
Mocking the church. That's risky.
Very risky. And even using things like, well, devil's urine instead of holy water.
Okay, that's just...
Blasphemous, right.
Yeah.
But from their perspective, maybe it was all part of their own religious practice.
Like an alternative religion.
Exactly. They had their own sacraments, their own symbols. There's even talk of preaching blasphemies and giving out a diabolical sacrament.
Wow, a whole inverted belief system. And then, of course, there's the whole issue of sacrifices.
Yeah, that's where things get really dark. The trial records talk about all sorts of sacrifices. Blood sacrifices at initiations, animal sacrifices, usually involving burning and the use of ashes.
And I'm guessing human sacrifices too?
Unfortunately, yes, often children. It's truly disturbing.
Whether those accusations were true or not, it shows just how deep the fear of witches ran.
Absolutely. And then Murray throws in this really interesting idea, the sacrifice of the god himself.
What, like a ritual death and rebirth?
That's what she suggests. And often, it was symbolized by the burning of a goat. It's a tough one to wrap your head around.
It is. But sacrifice was a part of many ancient religions, usually to appease the gods or ensure a good harvest.
Right. Maybe these were distorted echoes of those older practices. Of course, the human sacrifice allegations, if true, are horrifying.
Absolutely. It's a dark side of history we can't ignore. But beyond these big rituals, what about the everyday magic? The charms and spells?
Those are all over the records, whether magic, harming people or animals, making effigies, fertility and anti-fertility rites. You name it, they were accused of it.
It sounds like a real grab bag of magic.
It is. But what's interesting is that healing practices also appear. So not all magic was seen as evil.
Makes sense. In many cultures, magic has always been a tool for both good and bad.
Exactly. And the fact that witches were accused of both harmful and healing magic might tell us something about how they were perceived in their communities.
Like they were both feared and relied upon.
Maybe. Perhaps they filled a role that traditional healers once held.
So not just agents of darkness, but maybe healers as well. Okay, and what about those iconic images? The flying ointments, the magical words, the spells. Did those show up in the records too?
Oh yeah, those were big. They talk about ointments for flying, specific words and spells for everything from transportation to cursing and shape-shifting, even conjuring animals like cats to control the weather.
It really paints a picture of a different way of seeing the world, a world where magic was real and powerful.
Yeah, and maybe it reflects those older animistic beliefs where spirits were everywhere, in everything.
Right, nature was alive with magic. Okay, so we've talked about structure, rituals, and magic. Now let's get into something that always captures the imagination. Fairies. How did Murray connect this alleged witch cult with the world of fairies?
Murray's theory is that fairies weren't just a separate belief system. They were actually part of the same complex of pre-Christian beliefs that fueled the witch cult.
So fairies were pagan deities.
Maybe not exactly deities, but definitely supernatural beings from an older time.
Like the old gods, pushed into the shadows by Christianity.
Yeah, exactly. They became the good neighbors, the wee folk. Less threatening than gods, but still powerful.
Okay, I'm starting to see how it all fits together.
And there are lots of examples in the trial records. Take Tom Reed, for instance.
Who was he?
He was Bessie Dunlop's contact in the spirit world, described as one of the good witches that win it in the court of Elfame.
So a good witch living in the fairy court.
Pretty much. And the way they describe the fairy court, the belief in fairy arrows that cause sickness, fairies controlling whirlwinds.
It all sounds very pagan, very animistic.
Right, like remnants of an older worldview where spirits inhabited the natural world.
And when people claim they'd met the Queen of Fairy, or entered fairy hills, it shows just how real this belief was for them.
Exactly. And even Joan of Arc, her fairies, were reinterpreted as evil spirits by the church.
Another example of how Christianity demonized older beliefs.
Exactly. And John Walsh, he said outright that some of his witchcraft knowledge came from different kinds of fairies. So the link between witches and fairies was definitely there in the popular imagination.
It's fascinating to think that the fairy faith might have been a kind of shadow religion, a way for older beliefs to survive, even in a Christian world.
That's Murray's argument in a nutshell.
Okay, now let's talk about the darker side of this. We know witches were persecuted relentlessly, so there must have been some kind of internal discipline, right? Ways to keep secrets and punish betrayal. What did Murray find about that?
The trial records give us glimpses, but it's not always clear. We do know that they punished even minor infractions.
Like what?
Well, Thomas Laius was accused of beating someone for spilling a dance.
For messing up a dance step.
Apparently. It suggests they had a strict code of conduct, especially during rituals. And Isabel Gowdy, she said she was punished for failing to harm someone with her magic.
So they expected results.
Yeah, it wasn't just for show.
What about the really serious stuff? What happened to those who betrayed the group?
Well, death seems to have been the ultimate price.
A bit extreme, don't you think?
Not in those days. It was a matter of survival. If someone confessed and revealed secrets, they were putting everyone at risk.
And the church wasn't exactly known for its mercy.
True. The Lorraine witches, they swore an oath of silence, and the penalty for breaking it was pretty clear,
Death.
most likely. And even those who confessed and then recanted often met a suspicious end. Think of John Stewart, found strangled in prison after confessing. It shows just how high the stakes were.
And how much pressure there was to keep silent. Okay, last but not least, let's talk about familiars. Those spirit companions, often in animal form, that were so closely associated with witches, how did Murray interpret those?
For Murray, familiars were another piece of the puzzle, another link to that pre-Christian past. She thought they might be like those old household gods or spirits, the ones people used to honor openly.
But now they were seen as demonic.
Exactly. And the forms they took. It's amazing, really. Cats, dogs, toads, weasels, birds, mice, even human-like figures.
So not just your typical black cat, then.
No, it was a whole menagerie. And the descriptions could be incredibly detailed, like the ethics imps, with names like Holt and Jarmara and Vinegar Tom.
Vinegar Tom.
Yeah, and others called Sack and Sugar. They each had their own tasks, their own personalities.
It's almost like a whole other society of spirits.
That's kind of how Murray saw it.
Yeah.
And maybe these animal forms reflect that ancient connection to nature, that animistic worldview.
Right, where everything was alive, everything had a spirit. It's definitely different from the idea of demons given by the devil.
It is. And in many cases, the accused seem to have had these familiars for a long time, like they were companions rather than something given by Satan, like Joan Waterhouse, whose familiar was similar to her mother's.
Like a family tradition.
Exactly. And then you get these cases where people confuse animals that appear after cursing with the devil himself.
Like they couldn't tell the difference anymore.
Right. So for Murray, familiars were another sign of that pre-Christian world, a world of spirits that lived alongside humans.
A world that maybe never fully went away.
Maybe not.
Well, listeners, there you have it. Margaret Murray's The Witch Cult in Western Europe, a book that still sparks debate and makes us question everything we thought we knew about witchcraft.
It's a fascinating, if controversial, look at a dark chapter of history. And whether you agree with all of Murray's conclusions or not, she certainly makes you think.
Exactly. And she forces us to consider the possibility that what we call witchcraft might have been, at least in part, a distorted reflection of older pagan traditions.
Positions that were demonized and driven underground.
Maybe never completely eradicated. So, listeners, what do you think? Did a hidden pagan religion really exist in the heart of Christian Europe?
Were these witches truly devil worshippers, or were they something else entirely? We encourage you to delve into the source material yourselves, to explore the arguments and counter-arguments. This deep dive is just the beginning.
And as you explore, consider this. If elements of paganism did survive, how much of what we call history is actually a retelling shaped by the victors? It's a question that resonates far beyond the world of witchcraft and challenges us to look at the past with fresh eyes. Thank you for joining us on Occult Archives. Until next time, keep exploring the shadows.